Hello, my name is Allison Hunt, and I'm going to read you the first book of the HAVENBELL trilogy called The Child of Harmony, written by Allison Hunt, copyright 2004, redrafted 2021. Chapter 1, The Maze of Mayleen. The rain fell like a blizzard of diamonds inside an old mystical forest far away. Sheets of rain hummed on the top of the roof that sheltered the only inhabitant of the island. The elven girl gazed outside of the window at the newly moistened foliage, wondering what lay beyond the hills where the trees thickened. She sat relaxed but always alert of her surroundings. Spending many summers in the forest, Trillium had somehow become part of it, and anything that entered the woods gave off a vibration, like she could feel their presence. She had explored every detail of this old mystical place. Sometimes she could hear a whisper, a voice in the wind, a vibrating life within the forest of Mayleen. She didn't know that she was soon about to go on a very dangerous and magical quest. She was unaware at this time how special her mission was. She would travel to many lands and fight against some of the most wicked creatures and fight alongside some of the bravest and most courageous friends she would ever have. As the rain fell, she closed her eyes as if in meditation. She opened her mossy green eyes and rose to observe hundreds of trees in the distance. Eagerness filled her for what lay beyond. She enjoyed the peaceful element of her home, not to mention the mystery of the forest. The excitement that had been building up inside of her could no longer hold. She fled out of the door into the sprinkling rain. The air smelled fresh and fragrant. The rain fell on her face and trickled down her neck, making her soft curly hair turn into auburn ringlets. The wind blew locks of hair back from her pointed ears and glowing emerald eyes, both true traits of the elves. Her shelter was a stone dwelling. It was a decent-sized home for an elf, with a main door, 3 windows, and a small fireplace inside for cooking and for cold nights. The ceiling was leak-free, and there was even a bed that had always been there. She remembered how huge it seemed as a child, but of course she had grown into it over a few summers. Her bow and arrow sat nicely in the corner, along with a candle in her self-made pack. A broken piece of mirror was propped up on one wall. Outside of her home was a beautiful garden full of lilies, daffodils, and forget-me-nots that overflowed in their boxes. A white owl flew overhead, hooted, and landed on a tree next to the girl. His feathers were starch white like baby powder and speckled with black spots. From his head, 2 huge yellow eyes gleamed like shiny coins. He was a thick-feathered ghost owl with fluffy feet and a solid black beak. His eyes brightened up when he saw the fair-skinned girl. "Good morning, Duran," she greeted, without having to turn around. She knew he had returned. "Good morning, Trillium," he cooed. "The day awaits and the forest calls." The two were companions and close friends. Duran had taken care of her when she was young and trained her in archery. He was the only enchanted owl she had ever met. Duran traveled to Fathia and Fairy Island for supplies like cloth and seeds. He didn't speak or share much about his travels. Fathia was the land she came from, the land of the elves. Later she would meet many elves, good and evil, for there was a darkness spreading throughout the lands. Fairy Island is a land full of fairies, large and small. The large fairies were very old and very powerful. She would become one and first of the only visitors welcomed upon their land. She would be sent to recover a magical relic for them, but her friend would accidentally commit a horrible crime. Duran taught her rules and disciplines, but spoke vaguely of when or where she would use them. There were no other elves on this island, no one she had ever encountered. "I will continue to search for the entrance to the maze after the rain lifts." She held her face to the sky, letting the raindrops slowly trickle down her cheeks. The forest seemed to sigh around her, and a refreshed smile filled her smooth skin. The rain showered the garden, making the flowers and vegetables green and fresh. Duran brought her seeds to plant, and she tended her garden most often. He went to Fathia, the land of the elves, once a year to gather the seeds. Trillium liked to watch things grow, and ate mostly what she grew. Sometimes she hunted, but only if the meat and fur were needed. Duran watched her intensely, the yellow color of his sparkling eyes turning almost black. Trillium's elf-green eyes shifted into a crystal blue. Duran noticed the change, but would not tell her of her transformation. She would not yet understand. The clouds started to part and sunbeams streamed through the forest, hitting each leaf's dew, making the trees glow brilliantly. A beam danced in her eyes, fading the blue into a very earthy green as the sun warmed her skin. The entrance is beyond. You must prepare for your journey, Duran informed. Almost ready, she answered and rushed into her dwelling to grab her belongings. As she entered, she saw a green flicker out of the corner of her eye. A very old amulet hung on the piece of mirror on the wall. As it swayed back and forth, the gems sparkled. Mother, Trillium whispered, and picked up the amulet. Its earthy gem flashed, and the intricate golden designs around it felt smooth between her fingers. She slid the necklace over her head and tucked it back into her deerskin clothing. Trillium longed for her mother's face and warmth. She had been so young when she arrived in Mayleen, and her memories had started to fade like dreams often do. She would never see her mother again, but her sorrow no longer burned like her spirit. Trillium picked up the amulet and clasped it around her neck. Then she grabbed her water skin and candle and put them in the pack alongside with fruit, vegetables, and dried meat. She trained with her bow and arrows at an early age and became a very good shot. Elves were known for their supreme skills in archery. With everything ready, she left her stone house, the only shelter she had known for many summers, and looked again. A troubling thought occurred to her and lingered in her mind like an echo in a cave. How soon will I come back? She wondered. Will I ever come back? On the way towards the creek, all trouble left Trillium's mind like the butterfly's wings. The forest filled her with amazing energy, and she eagerly enjoyed its sweetness. Trillium dashed through the woods, jumping over rocks and twigs. She moved with lightning speed. Everything flashed by, making a brown and green mosaic from the fabulous mixing of earth tones. As she ran, Duran followed her up from above. She explored the woods every day and memorized all she saw, but had failed at her attempts to enter the maze. She could hear the soft roar of the ocean at times when in certain areas of the forest, but had never made it out to sea. She was trapped in by walls and trees and would need to beat the maze to finally see it. Behind her home was an enormous stone wall. The rocks that protruded out from it were sharp and jagged. When she was younger, she often tried to climb over the towering wall. It always resulted in injury. When inside her heart she knew she could not cheat the maze. The only way would be to explore the forest where the trees thickened. She believed this was the outer wall, but could find no way in. She jogged through the trees and came to a small path that led to a clear creek that trickled through the forest. She dipped her water skin in. The water fell smooth over the rocks, making many small bubbling pools. The stream stretched for a ways and then came to a curve. Loneliness faded in and out of her heart. All of these summers she had done fine with Duran and the forest creatures as company, except for the constant heartache she felt for her mother. The older she got, the more she wanted to get out of Mayleen and meet other elves and life forms. Trillium had once asked Duran to take her away to Phadia, even though she knew he could not, and that her future was this maze. Lately her dreams were flooded with images of unknown others, and elves as well. One in particular stood out from the rest, a handsome man with greenish gold eyes, yellow hair, and 2 large white wings that grew from his back. It was him she now saw as she gazed into the water. Duran watched closely, wondering what she was thinking. The greenish gold eyes disappeared, snapping Trillium back to reality. The water skin filled and was stored back into the pack. Trillium looked up at the branch that Duran was perched on and gave a head nod to continue her quest. By the time they reached the outer maze, it was nearing noon. The sun was bright and warm on the forest canopy. The floor of the forest was shaded and cool. The leaves lit up with the sun shining through them. Glints of sun hit Trillium's face as she walked. Trees began to get closer together. She had found the outside of the maze. Thorn bushes climbed up the base of the giant trees, making it very painful to slip between them. Duran landed on Trillium's shoulder and rubbed his soft white head against her neck. This was his way of showing affection, Trillium said. There are no shortcuts, no way to cheat it. The purer your heart, the clearer the way. There will be danger. Who knows what lives in this maze? If you are true, you'll find the way, he coached. There's just one small problem. I haven't found the entrance yet, Trillium said, a little disappointed. Duran's eyes began to shift and stare wildly. The black in the center dilated until almost no gold was visible. You will, Trillium, you will, he cooed, and flew off into the sky. Trillium stared at him until he was no longer in view. Calling for him would do no good. He often left without any explanation, and right now he was not her main concern. A loud cracking sound shot through the forest as Trillium fell from a tree. The branch scraped her leg on the way down and spilled her hard into the dirt. The sharp branch had poked her calf, sending pain up her leg. She had been trying to find the way in by observing every bush and tree. The trees grew tightly intertwined, making the wall of the outer maze. She fell trying to sneak a peek at the inside and had earned herself a nice bloody scrape. No shortcuts, Duran had said, she reminded herself. Despite the throbbing in her leg, Trillium continued to observe the trees. After a while, with no luck and an empty stomach, it was time to rest. There was a tall tree with soft grass underneath that looked peaceful and inviting. She took out some fruit and vegetables for lunch, freshly picked from her own garden the day before. Filled up and once again hopeful, Trillium sprang up ready to find the way in. No trouble ever stayed in her mind or mood for too long. The throb in her leg persisted, but she successfully tucked this into the corner of her mind and moved on. Moving quickly, she scanned carefully for a tunnel or door. In the distance, she could see a patch of blue flowers she had never seen before in Mayleen. Trillium moved towards them and saw a circle of 8 dying oak trees. In the center was a small oak just beginning to grow. The sun came down in one brilliant beam on the small meadow. It made the blue flowers glow like the sky. Some may live while others die. The beauty left shall fight and strive, her mind sang. It was an old nursery rhyme Duran had taught her. Trillium jogged the deep corners in her mind until she could remember the strange rhyme. Suddenly it all unfolded before her. She walked through the flowers into the circle of dead trees and leaned down to touch the new oak sprout. A stone circle moved upwards out of the dirt next to the living tree, making a grinding sound as it surfaced. Trillium watched with surprise. It was a small stone cylinder with a hinge on top. Carefully clamping the ridge between 2 fingertips, the capsule opened with ease. Inside was a small yellow scrap of paper. She opened it and read, "Face the old trees. Between the center two is the maze of Mayleen." A burning sensation began on her chest, and she grabbed for the chain around her neck. "It's glowing. Never has it done that before." Trillium stared at it in awe. It shimmered an emerald green and sent off powerful waves of warmth. "This must be the way," she confirmed. The amulet dimmed. Trillium put the small paper back into the stone cylinder's opening. After clicking the lid, it rotated back into the ground with a high-pitched scraping sound that made Trillium cringe. The answer was staring me in the face all this time, but the flowers were not here before, she wondered. The matter was quickly thrown out of her mind by the gratefulness of finding the entrance. Although things disturbed her, Duran had taught her not to focus energy on the negative or dwell on uncertainties. She looked straight ahead, and her amulet lit up once again. She walked through the old oaks and touched the wall behind it. The large stone wall behind the trees began to roll slowly to the right. Twigs, branches, and ivy snapped as the stone wheels turned slowly, breaking free of many summers' worth of overgrowth. Trillium walked through the entrance and into the maze. She looked into the maze's interior and grinned at the sight of unknown territory and adventure. Then she noticed something that made her heart stop. All of the sounds in the forest had completely vanished. not a bird or crack or tap of any animal. This made her uneasy, scared, and worst of all, the sun was starting to go down. It had seemed like just a half an hour had gone by, but Trillium realized it had been half of the day. To her left was a long stretch of path. She could clearly see the wall that was at its end. Dead end. That only leaves one direction, she decided. Trillium traveled right where the path began to curve, moving fast considering her wounded leg. She had to use the last of the sunlight before it turned dark. The nights were still very cold and pitch black. The forest seemed pleasantly sweet. The vegetables grew lush, and many unusual flowers grew in thick clusters. The air began to chill a little, and a small spring breeze blew about. Trillium began to jog around the turn. It was wide and very long. It soon became tiring, but she pressed on. The sky was getting darker by the second, and just as she believed the curve would never end, she came out into a small clearing. Trillium turned around and faced 3 openings, the one she came from, and 2 leading 2 different directions. On the right was a circular clearing. She walked around the circle, finding nothing but grass. It was completely dark now, and she sat and rested on the soft earth. Trillium reached for her pack and retrieved a small white candle. Setting the candle down in front of her, she began to chant. "Candle, candle, show for me what ith my way I'd like to see. Out of Mayleen to the wondrous sea, help me find my destiny." The flame lit itself in a bright flash. She then began to aid her wounded leg. Her mind swirled and thoughts raced about the 2 entrances. She decided waiting until daylight would be smarter than going in the dark. She sprawled on the ground, stretched out her body, and fell asleep the minute she laid her head down. Dreams began to flood her mind. She saw nothing but could hear a faint voice, a soft voice, and her mother's words. The fuzzy veil of black lifted to reveal her mother's face. It was crystal clear, unlike her fading memories. Smooth skin, earthy eyes, and narrow-pointed ears like her own. Her features were small and delicate. Her light brown hair bounced on her shoulders. Her mother was inside the woods in Fathia. She rubbed her stomach where her baby was growing. Jason knew it was a girl. She knew it right away. Underneath a nearby tree, a group of white flowers grew close to the trunk. They were the most common wildflower in the forest of Fathia. "I shall name you Trillium," her voice sang softly, "because it is made of the earth, water, fire, and wind. With these elements as one, a more beautiful life is born." Her mother's eyes looked like a forest that seemed to take you into its branches and entwine you into its ivy and moss. Her mother's hand was in a fist. She opened it to reveal a green stone. "This will help you," she whispered so silently that Trillium thought she could hear bells ringing. She awoke slowly. She could hear Durand calling her name. She blinked at the sunlight until her eyes could focus on the owl. "You did very well. I knew you could get in," he chirped. "Durand, I had this dream." She stopped abruptly and saw something on the ground next to her. It was the green stone. "Durand, it passed through my dream. It passed through. It's as green as my mother's eyes," Trillium said, half dazed. "I had a dream about her in the night. Her face was so clear it was like being with her again." She stared off, remembering the images. "I have a feeling the stone has something to do with this maze, but I can't figure it out." A crooked smile sat upon her lips. Then once again her troubles were stored in her mind for later. Durand had a good advantage. He could see the maze from above, and he often spoke of the ocean beyond. Help was not given to her. This was made clear in the beginning. Information from him was always left unfinished. Durand never talked about what lay beyond the sea. Fathia and Fairy Island being the only exceptions. He told her that if he helped her, it would interfere in her own learning. She felt a lot of love for Durand, her only friend and wise teacher. Trillium knew him well enough to trust his words and never asked many questions. She ate some more fruit for breakfast and drank the crystal-clear water. "I wonder which path is the right one," she asked herself after repacking her bag. Durand cocked his head to the side. His eyes grew large in surprise as he watched the girl dash gracefully into the passage furthest left. She moved fast. Duran began to fly after her, following from above. "What makes you sure this is the right way?" Duran called down. "What makes you sure this is the right way?" Duran asked. "I followed my heart like you told me to. My heart feels this is the way. I sense it. White fire, that is what you called it once," she replied. Duran hooted with satisfaction. "Now you're starting to understand," he cheered. After a very long curve, twice as long as the first, the maze twisted and turned. She went through 3 tight curves and up a long straight. She walked at medium pace, a little tired from the long distance traveled in this day. Time seemed to bend in the maze. Getting into it seemed to take all day. "I've been traveling for hours, but it seems like it's only afternoon." The maze remained absolutely silent and eerie. The path she followed was made of dirt and small pebbles that scuffled as she walked. The walls of the maze were made of gigantic trees that seemed to touch the sky. The trees grew closer to each other, leaving no room in between. Trillium admired the maze and its unknown creator. It was truly beautiful and clever. She saw some more blue flowers growing in patches and asked Duran about them. "I believe they are called bachelor buttons. At least they were last time I asked." "Who did you ask?" Trillium inquired, trying not to push him. "The fairies grow them in Fairy Island." "What's it like?" Trillium asked, eager for more detail. "It's a place of magic and beauty. There are acres of flower fields. Bachelor buttons grow all over and come in many different colors." Trillium imagined running through a field of them, but was interrupted by a strange feeling that entered her awareness. She had never been into the maze until yesterday, but she had a very close connection to the forest. She was aware that they were not alone. A crow landed on a broken trunk of a rotted tree and began to cackle. The veil of silence lifted. Trillium could hear the sounds of the forest, and she listened to the high twitters and sweet songs of the birds, too many to distinguish. Trillium's stomach did flips, but she was relieved to hear the noises again. "I've never seen a black bird like that before, Duran. What a horrible noise it makes." Just then an image flashed in her head. Trillium was 10 summers old, and Duran had been training her with the bow and arrows. They had set up targets by the clearing near her home. They propped them up in the trees, and Trillium was challenged to shoot them. Each shot fired never tapped a target. A bird had perched on one of the targets. It was black and unknown to the forest. Duran told her that the evil bird was a crow. He also said that they bring danger and darkness wherever they go. Trillium, at 10 summers old, shot the crow with no hesitation, striking it in the neck. "That's the most awful noise I've ever heard," she had said. Now she saw the bird for a second time. Faster than Duran could respond, the bird was dead on the forest floor with an arrow through it. "Don't bother, Duran. I remember," Trillium laughed. Duran let out joyful hoots. "And I hope I don't see another." She pulled the arrow out of the crow while holding it with one foot. Slinging her bow behind her, she moved on. After traveling all day, the sun began to set, making the scattered clouds iridescent pink in orange fire. She stopped and reached for her candle. "Candle, candle, show for me, woodeth my way I'd like to see. Out of Mayleen to the wondrous sea, help me find my destiny." The wick flickered and lit with a burst of fire. She insisted to press on. She unrolled some deerskin to drape herself in, and immediately the layers warmed her up. The forest made her uneasy at night, and she couldn't see much except for the path. The shadows that fell made the ground come alive. The grass swayed, and the wind that blew through the trees made its thunderous roar. The end of the trail curved right and split into 2 different directions. One path stayed straight, the other went left. Trillium began to wonder how long the maze must have taken to build. She took the path in front of her that led into a sharp turn. She followed the maze's twists and curves until late into the night. After some time, Trillium came upon a giant tree that grew in the middle of the stone walls. It towered high above her, its arms reaching like tentacles. As she held the candle up to it, shadows danced on the wall of the maze. The flickering candle animated the branches, making them twist and twitch. The limbs and arms reached out wildly. Trillium's heart raced at first sight of this massive figure. Her eyes began to dilate until she could see the tree more clearly. It stood still and began to look like a comfortable place to sleep. She sat the candle down and blew it out with a swift breath. In the night, she dreamed of a large stone structure with towers on each of the four corners. As she watched, it slowly began to crumble away until there was only one tower left standing. There was a beautiful girl. She was not an elf, and she had small round ears and big brown eyes. A long piece of material full of design and color hung loose to her feet. She had pink dainty wings and sang beautiful songs of harmony that seemed to put Trillium into a trance. "My name is Eternity. I am the Chantress. Who are thee?" the girl sang like a bird. Music and rhyme had not been heard by Trillium since before she left Phaedia. It was somehow soothing to hear somebody singing again. She could faintly remember the gatherings of the elves where people danced and played music together. The sun illuminated around the winged girl. Her brown hair hung long down her back. Before Trillium could answer, she began to wake up with the sun shining in her face. She put her hand over her eyes to block the sun. "Duran?" she asked the fuzzy white ball that looked down at her from a tree. He ticked his tongue, then flew over and nuzzled her neck. "What is made out of stone, is very tall, and has towers for each of its corners?" Trillium asked, and then yawned. "Is this a riddle?" Duran inquired. "It is not a riddle, nor a joke, but a dream," she replied. "You had a dream of a castle? But you've never seen one." Duran became excited at this. "A castle? That sounds wonderful," Trillium exclaimed. A big smile grew on her face. "What is its purpose?" "I have told you about kings and queens and other rulers of the lands. They live there. I have seen 3, and they are very beautiful." Duran twittered with glee. "Do you suppose I will ever see one?" "You will someday." It looked peaceful, a little strange, but very serene. Trillium would in fact see castles and palaces, all which were extremely different. Some would be a pleasure to see, and some would become a nightmare. Some leaders would even live in caves, and some even lived underground. When her thought broke, she jumped to her feet, ready to go again. "I want to solve this maze and see what's beyond Mayleen." There was a fork visible in the road ahead. A gold flicker of light gleamed from the path. Trillium rushed to ease her curiosity and looked down at the object. It was a golden half circle. She examined the details on the gold plate and reached down to pick it up. In the center was the letter T. Next to it, she found a brand new arrow. It looked like it had a pure silver tip. All of her arrows were getting old and worn from use. The point of the new arrow was very sharp. She looked at the gold object again. "My name?" she asked Duran. "There must be another half to the gold circle. That might help us understand what the letter T is for," Duran helped. "I can't look for the other piece now. I have to solve this maze," Trillium said with some disappointment. Duran wished her well on her search and then left again. Trillium felt love for him but was troubled by her mission. Duran held her with high expectations. She was tired of not knowing whom she was and where she was going. She longed for someone to communicate with and tell her more about the other islands outside of Mayleen. Duran had helped a little, but would never tell her all of the truth. Where she stood in the fork, she could see a path going up, one to the side and one to the south. Trillium decided to go south. The smooth stone walls began to get colder and jagged. Up ahead, she could see a big tree towering over the stone walls. She kept traveling until she was underneath it. She was worn and dehydrated, but the water can only held a sip. She tried to jog the best she could around the curve and down the long straight. Halfway through it, she slowed again, weakness possessing her body. At the end of the straightway, the path took a small left turn. Trillium cleared the turn and rubbed her eyes in disbelief. A little energy was restored, and she ran to what she saw. Her face was pale, and her lips were an unhealthy shade of gray. She looked at the round object protruding from the ground. It was a well. She could hear and smell the water flowing. Instantly, she turned the crank on the side and lowered the bucket. When it came up, water sloshed back and forth. Trillium eagerly stuck her face in the bucket and washed. The water was cool and rejuvenating. She lifted her head, letting the droplets drip down her face and neck. The green of her eyes shifted into a crystal blue. The water skin was refilled, and she began to chug it so fast that she was barely breathing in between gulps. She began to get color in her face and lips again, and her eyes changed back to green. When she was done, she felt more energetic and began to run through the stone maze. There was another left turn and another straightway. When she reached the end where the path curved right, she could see the tip of the giant tree again. Trillium began to feel unsure about where she was traveling and pulled the amulet out for help, but it remained cold and dark. She followed a path as it curved. There was another left turn and a long curve, the longest one so far. After hours of walking, Trillium came out of the enormous bend. The forest began to take the place of the stone walls until the walls of the maze were trees once again. The sun began to disappear. There were holes worn in her boots. She sank to the ground. Finally, she found a clearing full of grass and flowers. The fragrance was sweet and delightful. Trillium took 4 big drinks from her water skin and sprawled on the ground. Sleep came easily to her tired muscles, feet, and bones. A hot and deadly fire swept through the forest, leaving a path of destruction and death. It was not Mayleen from what Trillium saw. The temperature burned and the smoke was suffocating. Horrible screams arose on a hot wind. There were figures running away from the fire. There were other elves who had long ears just like hers. Confusion ran wild. Trillium saw a man caught in the fire. He was screaming for help. She kept running with them, scared for her life. Then she noticed somebody was pulling her along. Her feet felt shorter. She looked up and saw her mother's face full of terror. Trillium realized she was just a little girl and her mother was pulling her away from the danger. The smoke was thick and burned her eyes. "The wizards have come! The wizards have come! Fathia's burning! Run! Run! Run!" a voice shouted. Trillium's mother glanced over her shoulder at the elves trapped in the inferno. Tears rolled down her face. She could hear the screams. Terror filled her mother's face as they continued to flee. Trillium opened her eyes and saw the sun lighting up the leaves in the forest canopy. Beads of sweat rolled down her face. There was so much she wanted to ask Duran, and with a quick leap she was on her feet again. Her mouth was dry, and she craved a cold drink of water. Trillium was about to leave when she spotted a round stone like the other she had found. She picked up the stone. The red and orange color swirled inside, reminding Trillium of fire, she whispered. There was a new path in front of her. The awareness she had of the forest was dim. She tried the white fire, as Duran would say, but she felt neither one was the way out. Her special senses numbed. She tried to explore the new path. Memories flooded her head as she walked. The dream of her mother replayed itself over and over again in her mind. "Caw, caw!" a bird called down from above. It instantly dove for her head. She ducked, but not fast enough, and the bird took a sharp peck out of her scalp. Trillium grabbed for an arrow out of her quiver, taking a peck to the arm. She gave the crow a good swat and stuck it with the arrow through the chest. It let out a wretched squawk that made Trillium flinch. Her hand rose to her head to examine the wound. It wasn't very deep, but when she lifted her hand, she was not surprised to see blood. In the trees, 5 more birds waited. Their eyes were bright yellow and seemed to turn in their sockets. Their ebony feathers were shiny and reflective, each crow with a set of dangerous claws. Trillium's stomach began turning from their dark presence. It was not often that she felt something capable of evil. As she raised her bow and arrow, all 5 birds flew at her. Trillium snapped the bow accidentally, misfiring into the hard soil. She screamed at the birds that pecked their stinging beaks into her flesh. She ripped backwards twice, knocking the birds to the ground and grabbing another arrow before she landed. In 2 blinks, Trillium stretched the bow, steadied it, and let it go, sending it soaring through the air. It pinned the bird to a tree through its chest. The awful cries grew worse, almost deafening. The sharp pain of the beaks attacking her body continued. A crow dug its beak into her ankle. Trillium swiftly kicked the bird and crushed its head beneath her boot. There was 3 left now. Trillium reached for a jagged rock and smashed one with it. When it fell, she pitched the rock at it. Trillium grabbed for another arrow, this one with the silver tip, and arched her bow, shooting the bird closest to her with amazing speed and accuracy. The last crow flew towards her face with angry eyes, its sharp claws ready and beak opened, already encrusted with her blood. Before the crow reached her, It disappeared into dust. Trillium stood nervously in shock, and sweat rolled down her forehead. Her head filled with disbelief. She bent down and touched the black powder from the bird. It left a residue on her fingertips. The vibrating darkness lifted. What does this mean? She wondered. Trillium examined the kill to discover that all had turned into black powder. She pulled her arrow out of the tree, which had pinned one of the crows before it turned into dust. Wasting arrows was not an option. Duran gave her a set of 5 arrows when she was younger. She then made her own set of 10 arrows out of wood, sharpened stone, and feathers. What kind of bird turns into dust? Trillium asked herself. Duran's voice filled her mind. Crows bring ruin and pain. It is best not to let them see you at all, for they see for evil. Duran had warned 10 summers ago. What if the wizards in my dreams are connected to the crows? It could be the only answer. They could have been a spell. Why didn't they turn into dust when I killed the first 3? The answer lay in front of her. She knelt down to pick it up. It was the silver arrow, the one she shot when they turned into dust. Trillium took her water skin and cleaned her wounds. The crows left marks all over her. The horrible dream about the fire replayed its graphic images in her mind. She saw her mother's terrified face and heard the screams of the elves. Trillium sank to the ground with her face in her hands and began to cry. A realization hit her like a wave and crashed upon her, causing her to pause in mid-sob. If they sent the birds to find me, that means the wizards have seen me. They found my mother, and now they are looking for me. Her head started to swim, looking for a way out of the mystery. Pieces of the puzzle started to form a rather frightening picture. She packed up and started to run. Safety was her only concern. Her mind began racing as fast as her feet. She looked at the new path in front of her. Thick gray clouds formed in the sky, hiding the sun and the heat. The wind began to blow a brisk spring gust through the trees, making them howl. Trillium, unprotected from the wind, was blasted on her face. With one arm over her eyes, she pressed on. "The giant tree!" she exclaimed. Shelter was in sight. She began to run faster, flinging the fresh mud up from the trail. The path curved a little to the right. The walls blocked the wind, but the rain continued to pour down. Running at full speed, she came around a large right turn. She came out at the familiar fork in the trail, where she found the gold half-circle. There was a sharp right turn that led to the giant fir tree. Underneath the tree was dry and comfortable. She sat and rested. There was a puddle that formed in the path from the rain. She leaned down to look at her reflection. There was a couple of painful wounds on her face from the crow attack. The eyes that looked back at her were not her own. "Blue," Trillium protested. "My eyes are green, not blue." Trillium stared, trying to get used to the change. Must be the light. She finally gave in and let the subject rest. The maze was one big loop from what Trillium just went through. Odd things had been happening lately. First the dreams, then the crows, and now the eyes that seemed to change in color. "There's nothing I want more than to see the ocean. Now I don't know if I'll ever get out of here, unless I missed a path somewhere." She got up and ran in the rain, going back the opposite way she came. Halfway through, the rain died down and finally stopped along with the wind. The dark clouds were parting, letting the sunlight through. When she came out of the curves, the path split. She remembered that the path to the left was where the path narrowed, and she had to walk sideways through it. The path to the right was the one she missed the first time. This brightened her up. "Maybe I'll find the way out after all," she said, full of hope. There was another puddle in the path. She leaned down to see her eyes again. "Green," she said. "Just as I thought." This problem didn't leave her head like the others. It stayed on her shoulders, waiting for an explanation that never came. Although she brushed it off at first and tried her best again, she knew that they had been blue. The stone walls went away and she was back inside the trees. It was nearing evening, and in another hour the sun would be setting. Trillium continued to follow the straight, now at a slower pace. Hunger began to nag at her, and her stomach growled. She was weak and tired. It had been yesterday when she finished the last of her vegetables. It was time to hunt or time to starve. Her weakness was growing. She gathered a pile of pine cones and began to make a trail with them. To the right of the trail, the trees became separated enough for her to venture inside. The branches snagged and snapped as she shimmied through. A clearing stood before her. She hid herself behind a tree and sat with bow and arrow ready. It wasn't long before she shot the rabbit and wrapped it in cloth for later. She followed the pinecone trail back to the maze and began following the path for a while. There was something shiny in the path ahead. The sun reflected off of the object, sending sparks of light shooting out in all directions. Trillium's mouth dropped open in bewilderment. She floated over to it and picked it up. It was the same size as the red and green stones, but it was crystal clear. The sun was setting behind the trees, and the clouds were pink and bright orange. She began to move faster. The hall in front of her was deceiving, and darkness fell fast. The candle lit after she sang the chant. There was a small split in the path ahead. She turned left and found a dead end. Trillium looked at the circular clearing and started to gather wood and debris. She cooked the rabbit and ate it greedily, feeling more satisfied than ever. There was a low roaring sound, melodic and soothing. Her wounds began to heal, and the food gave her energy. She picked up the candle and explored the other path. As she walked, the sound became louder and more intoxicating. At the end, there was a stone wall on one side. She held up the candle. It illuminated a tall, round object. Trillium came closer. She discovered a large stone circle on the wall. 4 stone hands reached out of it, waiting to clutch something. The stones could fit here, she figured, and began to set them in the hands, but the hands remained still. One hand remained empty. She would wait until morning to figure it out. Trillium returned to the clearing and fell into a deep sleep. At first she saw a blurry shape, then her eyes began to focus. Her mother stood before her. "This one is cold. This one is hot. This one is bold. This one is not," she spoke softly. Suddenly her eyes opened to see the sky, the forest, and the maze. She saw another stone next to her. It was a brilliant blue. She gathered her belongings and headed for the stone wheel. She put the stones in order: green, red, clear, blue. Nothing happened. The wheel held the stones, but only in the right order. The wheel seemed to stare at her, taunting her next decision. Trillium picked up the stones and tried again. Her mother's words repeated themselves in her head. The blue stone glittered, and inside waves crashed upon one another. "Water," she whispered, and placed the stone on the ground. "This one is cold." She then eyed the red and orange stone. "Fire." She set it next to the water stone. "This one is hot." She looked at the green stone. She could see trees and the color of her mother's eyes. "Earth," she mumbled. "This one is bold." She held the clear stone up to the sun, letting the light pass through. "Air," she said, contented. "This one is not." She examined and arranged them on the wheel. They fit neatly inside of the hands. A loud sound began as the hands closed around them. There was a louder grinding as the wheel began to turn. The stone door slowly opened. Trillium could smell a new scent of salt and decay. When the door fully opened, she took a peek outside. Beyond was a large body of water. The tranquil roaring she heard in the maze magnified. The waves crashed upon the mass of rocks. The ocean was huge. She could see nothing but water clear to the horizon. "I made it out to sea," she celebrated, and joy filled her heart. Trillium was deeply taken by the ocean's massive beauty. Cheerful and relieved, Trillium went through the open door and onto a small sandy path. She stood staring, her eyes latched on the waves. The path began to curve back and forth and came to a circle. In the circle was a plate inside the ground, identical to the one she found before she got into the maze. There was a handle on the top. Lifting the stone cylinder from the ground and taking off the lid, she exposed a hole. Inside were 2 large silver coins, 3 brand new arrows, and a bottle of pink liquid. Trillium grabbed the bottle. She was amazed at the color inside. The sun lit up the flaming pink liquid. The label on the bottle read medicine. There was also an old scroll. She unraveled it and read the message. "Gifts from a stranger. The dark wizards have stolen the shell of hope from Fairy Island. It is lost somewhere in the ocean. If it is not found, the fire will destroy us all." "The wizard?" she muttered. "Why didn't Duran tell me? If I'm the only one to ever solve this maze, this message must be for me. I am the special one, the one to save HAVENBELL." Farisef sat by a waterfall next to the smooth rocks. This was his favorite place, his secret place beyond Josephera Kingdom. The life of a prince was demanding, and his father's non-stop obsession with the new council was beginning to bore him. This place he called Misty Falls was his serenity, the place where he could clear his head and be at peace. His face was smooth like a child's, and his hair was gold and hung long to his waist. He wore light flowing clothes, a mix of cream and tan. Long wings of white feathers sat close to him, folded at his sides. Farisef could see a white object in the air approaching him. One day by the waterfall, a mysterious creature had flown in for a drink. Duran the owl, the only enchanted owl he had ever seen. Duran said he was busy on a mission training an elven girl. He never went into detail. He said this girl was the answer to the fire, the most deadly element in HAVENBELL. He made Farisef keep the information classified for the girl's sake. Many of the winged people spoke of the Child of Harmony. For some, it was the only hope they had left. The Child of Harmony would bring hope back to everyone. It was Duran again who had come to chat and drink the cool water. "Farisef," Duran greeted. "Hello again, Duran," Farisef returned. "The girl is almost ready. I will return to her soon," Duran informed. Then he nodded his head to excuse himself and flew off. Farisef watched him disappear. He enjoyed his visits, even if they were brief. His mind returned to his father, the king of Josephera. Farisef lived in the sky, and the land drained him physically. He needed to return. Satisfied, he stretched his wings and flew away from Misty Falls. Trillium stored the new arrows in her quiver and began down the path to the sea. She came to the shore and felt uneasy. She had never learned how to swim. The water in the forest was too shallow. Trillium had so many questions for Duran, and she needed his companionship as well. She felt lonely, helpless, and in need of a friend. Fog began to roll in, making her cold enough to throw on her extra deerskin. She sat with her arms and knees in her chest and thought about the sea. It began to scare her. Something dark appeared out of the fog. A figure stood aboard. He was draped in a long, loose black cloak. There was a boat, long, skinny, and very old. The figure held a long oar, pushing the boat closer. A shiver went up her spine. She approached with caution as the boat beached. The black cloth waved a hand slowly, inviting her in. She resisted, then was pulled by an invisible force. She put one foot inside of the boat, making it wobble, and got inside nervously. A hood fell over the face of the stranger. He turned his head slightly, briefly revealing a glimpse of his hollow jawbone and one grotesque sunken eye as the light flashed on his face. He turned his head slowly, looking fully at Trillium now. She could hardly see a shadow beneath his long hood. Then he suddenly lifted a bony hand and ripped the hood from his head, making Trillium scream. His deep black eyes were no eyes at all, and his pale skin was not skin but bone. Trillium looked nervously at the animated skeleton that now stood before her. The first thought she had was to jump out and swim as fast as she could back to Mayleen. But she was afraid of what might happen if she tried to run now. She did not know the rower's capabilities. His bony hand stretched out in front of her, and she remembered the 2 coins she had in her pack. She took them out, her head shaking slightly, and placed them in the skeleton's hands. The bony fingers closed tightly around them, popping and cracking as they made a fist. The skeleton took them and popped them into his empty eye sockets where they fit snug. This would have been funny to Trillium at any other time, but it frightened her now. The skeleton had eyes that were always staring at her, and huge grinning teeth yellowed with rot and decay. A few teeth missing, adorning him with a jack-o'-lantern smile. Trillium began to feel more nervous, expecting the possessed bones to grab her at any minute, but it only pushed the boat into the water and moved it along in slow, haunting strokes. Trillium let her nerves settle a little, but remained on edge. She looked at the sea. It was still covered in a haze of fog, and wondered how big it must look in its entirety. Being on a boat was new to her, and she thought it would have been more enjoyable without the grinning and staring monster beside her. She was seeing outside Mayleen for the first time, and it just so happened to be blocked by the fog. Instead, she began to think of the sandy shore and the salty smell of the ocean. The fog began to clear, and she could now see all around her. There were a couple of large cliffs on the fringes of Mayleen. In some spots it came down into the sandy white shore. The skeleton pushed the boat around the island, staying in the shallow waters. Trillium enjoyed the view despite of the phantom rowing the boat. Trillium watched the waves make their way to land. It turned out to be a beautiful sunny day, and she could hear the birds singing from the forest. It seemed like a goodbye song to her. Mayleen had been her home for 16 summers. She had been 3 summers old when she had been brought to the forest island. Mayleen was a wonderful and tranquil place. She knew no other environment. The dream about the wizards was not a dream at all. The fire took place just before she left Fathia. The dream began to surface memories for her. She could remember her mother clearly and the elves of Fathia. Now she was almost certain that her dream had been a reality, and that all those elves had really been killed along with her mother. Duran never told her anything in detail, including how her mother died. Trillium figured he didn't want to hurt her and give her nightmares. Too late for that. The forest gave her all that she ever wanted, except for one thing, a dependable companion. Duran never seemed to stay a whole day with her. Trillium longed to meet somebody new, somebody who would not keep secrets from her. She watched the islands and listened to the birds sing their farewell song. She would miss her home and all of the forest beauty. She figured that by the direction she traveled through the maze, she had come out on the same side as the island as her hut. They had traveled about a quarter way around the island itself. The strangers must want to take me closer to my destination, but why would they send such a ghoulish creature? Just then the fog began to roll in again, and it got thicker and thicker until she could no longer see the water. Trillium began to think about her mother, and a warm feeling started in her stomach, and her mother's face filled her mind. Trillium lowered her head hopelessly into her hands and stayed that way for some time. When she raised her head again, she was completely surrounded by fog. She stood up quickly, wanting to make sure that the bones were still steering the boat. She could not see an inch in front of her. There was nothing but the white fog surrounding her. She thought the boatman had vanished altogether until she came within a foot from him. The black cloth appeared, but his head mixed with the fog. The coin seemed to float in mid-air. Startled, she jumped back, making the long, skinny boat rock wildly. "You scared me," she shouted at the figure. There was no reaction. "You can't hear me, can you?" "You can't hear me, can you?" she asked. No reply. "What a great companion you are." She began to chuckle and laugh until she was outright fighting for breath. The boatman turned his head and stared at her. Trillium continued to laugh at him. His bony fingers made their way to her shoulder without her being aware. She jumped when she felt him touch her. The bones dug into her shoulder on pressure points that made her helpless. She curled up, sank to the floor, and whimpered from the pain. The piece of long cloth blew from the bone figure, exposing a bare ankle. Trillium looked at the narrow leg bone and gave it a good hard kick. The figure toppled, but the bone did not break, she had expected. It stood up again and came right for her neck this time, digging with both fleshless hands. Trillium tried to pull his fingers free with her own hands, but the creature was stronger than its frail image let on. She began to feel dizzy and could hardly breathe. With her windpipe closed off, she was only able to breathe small gasps at a time. She found the long oar on the floorboard and began to move it with her foot, trying to scoot it closer to her with the tip of her toe. She kicked him full force in the pelvis, jolting him up and forcing his hands free. She grabbed the oar and whacked the figure as hard as she could and made contact with his skull. The head flew completely off, making a swoosh sound as it hit the water, the coins popping out. She stood relieved. The boatman attacked, throwing all of its weight that was possible at her to knock her off the boat. Trillium grabbed his collarbone. She lost her balance. They toppled off together and splashed into the mysterious sea below.